Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, and an early Happy New Year to all of you who have been supporting this show and listening to this show, and we appreciate it. But we want to wish you a great holiday season, even though the Bengals aren't having a season up to snuff. Again, I am Anthony Cosenza for some of you who might be new to this show, and I'm joined by my co-host, Connor Howe. Connor, I know it's kind of a busy time of year, both in covering the team and trying to get the shopping and all that stuff done. Are you set for Christmas?
Haven't started yet. Probably should.
Oh, boy. I mean, you only got a couple
Yeah,
days. You only got a couple days left, man.
yeah. We'll figure it out. I'm good in the crunch time.
Yeah, okay. Well, if you're good in crunch time, that might mean you should have been suiting up for the Bengals this week and really this season, because the Bengals, when it came to crunch time, they did not step up to the plate, to use another sports reference. They hosted the Pittsburgh Steelers. They had a 20-9 halftime lead, Connor, yet they let it slip away and let it slip away in a fashion that was just pretty unbelievable. They scored 0 points in the second half. They had, I think, 38 or 39 total offensive yards in the second half after thoroughly dominating the Steelers. And, personally, it was a game that really, even though going into the game, the Bengals playoff chances were pretty slim, you got the idea that they were playing very inspired football against a team that they always seem to not play well against. And they came out in that first half. They were firing, and it looked good, but they let it slip away in the second half. Aside from your general thoughts about the game, Connor, I want to ask you, do you think that this game, I mean, we've talked about the coaching, we've talked about all the kinds of mishaps that have happened throughout the year. Do you think that this game also is the one to point to when it comes time for the discussion of off-season coaching change?
I mean, I think ultimately what it comes down to right now is that Mike Brown, I'm guessing, if I'm in his shoes, is guessing that this is a season of transition. So you put in Ken Zampese as the new offensive coordinator. You have new position coaches all over the defense, and who knows? Maybe they make a change or two in the coaching staff. I would guess Paul Alexander would maybe be the guy that they would, if they were going to just axe a position coach, I'd guess he'd be the guy on the hot seat. But at this point, it pretty much seems like the coaches or Brown is kind of set in what he's doing. The coaches are pretty established at what they're doing. I can't really fault Gunther. I have to fault the offense for the second half. I mean, 0 points. It's the second time in the past few weeks, the first being against the Bills, that they had 0 points. And yeah, this is the first time that it seems like people are really starting to realize that the offense has been really abysmal because all of the blame just kept getting pushed onto Nugent. And so at this point, I think you just have to understand. I mean, I think you have to have faith in Zampese. You have to say, well, he did really good in the first half. The Bengals had outscored the Steelers 20-9 in the first half, and they did. And even if they only scored 20 points in the game and they had a really bad second half, they managed to do that without AJ Green, who has put up like consistently 100 yards a game against the Steelers, pretty much except for the first week this year they played. And so, I mean, ultimately, I just think that you kind of have to let it go and just say maybe things just didn't go right in the second half. And yeah, I mean, granted, Zampese isn't going to be perfect, but they had a really good first half and things were going well, and they did that despite the offensive line still not really playing up to par. Dalton hasn't been the same guy this year as he's been last year, and I think people aren't really. I think people are making a lot of excuses for him, but he hasn't been the same precision guy that he was last year. And maybe that has to do with Marvin Jones being gone, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just Dalton taking a step back, which I personally think that might. It's not that he's taken a step back, but he's just last year he was masterful, and this year he's been very good. And so the drop off between those two is, and so I don't know. I think we've already talked about a lot of the coaching changes and potential and all that stuff. And I think if you're Mike Brown, you're kind of set where you're at right now, just hoping that this is an outlier season that you can bounce back. At least that's what I would guess, because ultimately, then if you get rid of everyone, which is a possibility, I think, but I don't think it's going to happen personally. I think that you would have to just tank everyone. And the thing is, despite the Bengals falling apart in this game, they still fought so hard in this game, way harder than they've been playing, aside from the fourth quarter in the playoff game in so long against the Steelers. I mean, they really haven't been that competitive against Pittsburgh. So I don't know. I think that there's pros and cons to it, but ultimately what it comes down to is that you really like the Mike Brown is resistant to change, and I just don't think he's going to do it.
Well, yeah, and I'm not really talking about so much, who's going to go. I mean, it's good thoughts there, but I'm just saying, is this really an indictment on the coaching staff? And I do agree with you, even though I don't agree with the sentiment that the Bengals may or may not should or should not clean house. I do agree with you that Mike Brown is very sluggish to make any kind of splashy moves, whether it's a coaching hire or anything like that. So I don't foresee an overhaul of the coaching staff this year, and I think there's probably that attitude you mentioned, Connor, of the maybe this is just a blip on the radar, and it was bound to happen at some point. I don't know. I look at it and I say, yes, the effort was there in the second half, or excuse me, the first half, and then you come out in the second half, and you have to wonder what that halftime message was to the players, because you then saw, granted, some of them were very ticky-tack penalties against the Bengals, but there were some that were pretty bad penalties against the team. That occurred.
Yeah, momentum really sucked.
Yeah, that occurred, and which I think the Bengals only had one penalty in the first half of that game, and then you see just an absolute, basically, I don't know what you want to call it, a stubbornness to make any kinds of wrinkles in game plans. And the Bengals were doing pretty well on defense, holding the Steelers to field goals, and they did so in the second half for the most part as well. But you look at it and you go, okay, well, you're holding them to field goals, but you're not getting a pass rush, and you're doing a very soft zone defense. And as you went into the second half, the Steelers undoubtedly looked at that and said, look, this is what they're going to give us again, most likely in the second half, which they did. And the Steelers took advantage, and they moved the ball. They got points when they needed to and ended up coming back to win. On offense, the Bengals didn't do much differently. And granted, it was working well in the first half, kind of the chain moving plays, hitting LaFell on slants, getting Tyler Boyd involved, and doing some other things. Yet in the second half, when they saw it wasn't working as well, they failed to get Tyler Eifert involved. They obviously didn't have an answer for A.J. Green's absence, who I guess was pretty close to playing if you saw some of the pregame stuff. But my point is this staff just and this has kind of been a story for the entire year. This staff hasn't done well with halftime adjustments, and that's kind of what you make your reputation on as a coach in the NFL, being able to adjust in game, being able to adjust at halftime, whether things are going well and you stick with a lot of your same concepts, or things aren't going well and you have to kind of switch up the game plan based on what you're seeing. The Bengals have just never been good at that. Do you agree with that, or am I overreacting?
I agree with the general sentiment. I think there's a couple of things that really stood out to me in the second half, and the first was that scripted plays versus unscripted plays was really, you could kind of tell that the unscripted plays really weren't working when the Bengals are put in those, third and longs or stuff where they don't have the traditional game plan and they have to, dial up one of those plays. It just wasn't hitting for whatever reason. Ultimately, I think, I think, I hate to say it, but I really think that without AJ Green, the Bengals aren't the same team as they are with him, and it's pretty obvious to say, but they really, I think Zampese did it, like you said, it didn't really look like he tried to do that much to change the game plan, and maybe that's been the point when you say, okay, you know what, keeping Eifert around to block, not on every play, but more often than he probably normally would have done with AJ Green in the picture. You just say maybe we don't do that. I mean, maybe we send him on more routes or whatever it is. But when you have an offensive line that isn't blocking an ineffective run game, and LaFell is your number one receiver, there's really only so much you can do. It's actually pretty impressive the Bengals were able to put up 20 in the first half. But I mean, that doesn't excuse the second half. And so I don't know. I just think that at some point, it also just has to be come to understood that the team really was limited in that game, and I don't want that to be an excuse for the coaching staff. Like you said, they should do a better job. They really should have done a better job in a game they could have easily beaten the Steelers when if they just scored maybe one touchdown in the entire second half. And so I don't know. It was frustrating to watch and to just see the offense continually not put points on the board, punt, 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 interception, whatever it is, and you just can't make excuses for that. I mean, you didn't have AJ, you didn't have Geo. I know that like it hurts, especially because those two guys were the top two pass catchers for the entire team besides LaFell and I mean, well, they were two of the top four, then I'll say pass catchers on the roster entering the season, and they would still be up there today. And so it's definitely hard to adjust to losing a player as versatile as Bernard and a receiver as talented as Green. But the Bengals were in the game in the first half, and you can't just say, well, the second half. I mean, it's okay. They fell off. Obviously, something has to change, and I think that just kind of shows that Zampese's still young. He really doesn't have that much experience in calling games and game planning and adjusting in the middle of a game, and hopefully that's taught him a couple of things, because I don't think the Bengals just promoted him to keep him around for a year. I really don't think they're that kind of team, and so I don't know. Hopefully that now that he has that experience with shorthanded like that he'll in the future, let's say when you have Green or Eifert out a game or two, that he'll be able to just adjust and understand this is what he should do on offense.
Yeah, you don't want to pull out the old hook for the guy 1 year in, but at the same time, when you see such a massive drop off in from one season to the next based on a coordinator change, that's
Definitely
something.
It's frustrating.
Yeah, it's it's hard not to point at the guy, but you're right. There are some personnel losses that were there against Pittsburgh. The Bengals lost to the Steelers 24-20, and not only is losing to the Steelers bad enough, they did so at home, and the loss sealed their fate as them not going to the Bengals are not going to the postseason for the first time since 2010 this year, and they are officially looking to 2017, which is kind of a bitter pill to swallow at this point. After you kind of hoped the Bengals would have a nice redemption after how the season ended yet again to the Steelers in the wild card game, and yet they couldn't get it done this year. They couldn't get through so many things that came their way, and it's going to be a very, very interesting offseason. One, I hope, and I'm sure Connor to some degree would agree with me, one, I hope that is marked with some sort of change, whether it's a more aggressive approach in free agency and the draft, making sure you identify the proper needs on this team, because there are some that are popping up, and maybe even coaching, whether you're a Marvin Lewis guy or not, whether you like some of the staff members that are there, obviously the discussion of coaching changes is there, and this might be an off season of even more change than we saw this year, but hopefully it's more for the better than it happened for the Bengals this year. But again, the Bengals now are, what are they now? 5-8-1, Connor? I've kind of lost track there.
Yeah, they're probably that.
I believe they're 5. Yeah,
if they have 5 wins, they're 5-8-1.
Yeah. I think maybe they're 6-8-1.
Might be 4-9.
Yeah, I don't.
I think
know.
they're 5-8-1. 5-8-1.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure.
That's the effect the Bengals have had on all of us. Yeah, and especially when you got to tally up 3 different columns instead of 2.
That too. When they plateau in January, it's not necessarily the best year for the Bengals.
Yeah, I believe they're 5-8-1 at this point because they have two more games to play. One of which is against the Texans. That's on Christmas Eve, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I do want to talk about something. Unfortunately, last week you couldn't join us, Connor, but Scott Schultze was with us. Now this week, Scott's not with us. He might join us later in the program. He's got some personal things going on, but he might join us later in the program. You're with us this week, but Scott put up an interesting post about trade value with AJ McCarron, and you look at the deal with, Brock Osweiler stepping in, and he is now being benched for Tom Savage in Houston after Houston paid him a ton of money to be their quarterback. I guess there's kind of a two pronged approach, and I don't know if you read Scott's column, uh, Connor. If you or any of the people listening haven't, please do so. It is very good, as are all of his columns. But he kind of
Yeah, he's good.
chronicles a lot of stuff about the background of Osweiler. Then you look at some of these teams that have taken these big gambles on guys like Kevin Kolb and who have just not worked out. This year, I would think that the trade value for McCarron, this 2016, because he actually played games last year and won a couple of games and did okay in the playoff game, had the Bengals in position to win that game. One would think that his value this year, especially with a weak quarterback class, would have been the highest that it has been. And though there's been no real documented news of teams ringing the Bengals phone off the hook for McCarron, it's undoubtedly correct that they probably got some sort of calls gauging interest of trade for McCarron at some point this offseason and this season. I guess there's a couple of questions here, Connor. Number one, if you look in your rearview mirror here, did the Bengals now, especially because hindsight being what it is, they're now looking to rebuild a little bit in 2017. Should the Bengals have explored a trade option, say if, for the sake of argument, they had a third round pick on the table, second round pick, something like that, and do they need to maybe think about that this next year to accumulate draft picks and stockpile guys and maybe draft another backup quarterback? If you remember, they have Jeff Driscoll on the roster, who they seem to like. He's been on the active roster as a third quarterback all year. So what do you make of the situation here, both past and future?
Yeah, I mean, I think McCarron's trade value hit an apex right around this time last year, or well, not this time, but like right after the season ended, when he, barely lost a playoff game. And granted, I don't think it was really McCarron that was pretty much Vontaze perfect. But that aside, McCarron, I think, is not as like high of a trade value as he was last year, just because of the fact that he hasn't played for so long, and
Right.
you have guys like the whole Osweiler thing really sucked for him, because it seemed like him and Osweiler were 1A and 1B in terms of like most desirable quarterbacks, and then Osweiler goes to Houston and puts up a stinker, and then you have Matt Barkley comes out of the woodworks in Chicago, and he's been playing pretty well this as of late at least, and so I don't know. And if you're the Bengals, you look at this year's draft and you probably have 10 or 11 draft picks with all those compensatory picks, probably
Yep.
three or four added into the formula. And so, like, I think the idea of trading McCarron would be awesome. I just don't think it's something that's going to happen, even with a Jeff Driscoll on the roster, unless they're really desperate to get another pick. And I would think they'd only be desperate to get another pick if they were going to try to trade up. But yeah, so in that case, I really just don't see it happening. I just don't see the fit. And I think the Bengals see McCarron as a guy who's probably going to make some pretty decent money in free agency, regardless of whether or not he gets that giant Osweiler deal. He'll still get pretty good money. He'll probably land him a third, fourth, or at the worst, probably a fifth overall, or a fifth round compensatory pick. So you might as well hold on to the guy who is still a reliable backup. And even if that means keeping Driscoll on the roster and holding him until after McCarron is done, and then you have, I think, 2 years of Driscoll. It's not the worst formula in the entire world. I mean, you have three quarterbacks on the roster, which isn't obviously ideal, but you have 2 years or next year of McCarron, and then 2 years after that with Driscoll, and you're kind of set at the position. And then if I don't know, the Bengals can kind of gauge where they want to go from there. But I think last year was probably the time if they were going to. I think that hindsight being 2020, I think if they knew Dalton was going to stay healthy through this whole year, and or they knew the Bengals would struggle this year, I think they might have been more
Yeah.
willing to pull the trigger. But you really can't envision that stuff, especially when Dalton just got hurt on that fluke injury. And so I don't know. I'm at peace with where they are. It kind of sucks that you have a quarterback who is pretty much a trade chip just waiting to be used as your backup. Who I just wrote in the Q&A that's going to go up in a couple of days that McCarron's a better trade chip than both quarterbacks on the Texans roster, which is weird to think about, but it's true because Osweiler has that massive deal and Tom Savage is still, just a guy at this point, and McCarron's won some games. And so it's weird that you have a quarterback who's the backup who probably you don't want to see take the field, who has more value than a lot of starting quarterbacks in the NFL at this point. I mean, Jay Cutler, whoever starts for the Jets, the Texans, the Browns, he could start for a lot of different teams, or at least in theory, unless he puts an Osweiler and just goes somewhere and wets the bed. But it's interesting. But I think that with so many draft picks, I just don't think it's going to happen.
Going to the Browns would be interesting on a number of different
It'd be
levels.
fun.
Yeah,
I mean, it'd be weird, but
it'd be very interesting on a number of different levels. McCarron was pegged by ESPN as the number two NFL quarterbacks who could change teams in 2017 and do so in a positive way. Obviously, national media being what it is, they want to ride the Patriots bandwagon. So Jimmy Garoppolo topped the list. AJ McCarron, no Romo, no. Well, I mean, I don't have the whole list. I do know that Jimmy Garoppolo is number one, and McCarron's number two. He is signed all the way through next year, and the writer who talked about this possibility says the Bengals typically are not wheelers and dealers. McCarron played well enough in limited exposure to make a positive impression. McCarron has completed 102 of 160 passes, which is 64%. That's pretty accurate. 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Anonymous personnel director said, I think he will stay there, meaning Cincinnati. They're not a big trade team. I think they like him, and someone would have to blow their socks off with a big pick. Obviously, that was kind of the whole deal with the Carson Palmer thing, where Mike Brown.
Yeah, it kind of have to be like a Bradford thing when Bridgewater got hurt, and then Bridgewater. I don't know why I said Bradwater. Bridgewater just his trade value just skyrocketed, and it was a good fit for him, but. I think it would take a starting quarterback getting hurt in training camp or later for that to really be an option for him.
Yeah, or a team missing out on a quarterback should they have wanted one in the draft. And
fair.
This, again, is not a great draft for quarterbacks by things I've been hearing. So there could be a team out there that not a lot come to mind. Maybe New Orleans is a team that wants to groom a guy behind Drew Brees once he finally retires. You mentioned Cleveland, who is on their never-ending search for a quarterback. I don't think the Bengals would probably want to send a guy within the division. Arizona might be a team that they want. They want to group someone. Yeah, I mean, so there are a number of teams that could come calling. It would just probably take something pretty big for the Bengals to move on this. My thing is this: is you're kind of playing with house money with McCarron here because. You spent a 5th-round pick. He fell farther than a lot of people thought. I mean, he wasn't thought of as a great NFL prospect when he's coming out of college, but a lot of people thought he'd maybe be in that 3rd or 4th round range, maybe be a backup, some not so good team grooms, and maybe he gets a start like we've seen from the Browns and the Bears and teams like that. He fell to the 5th round, and if a team comes calling with a 2nd-round pick, a 3rd-round pick, you've got a guy like Driscoll that apparently the Bengals like on the roster. Andy Dalton is relatively durable despite what happened to him last year. I don't know. I think you're kind of playing with house money there. And if you really trust your draft and develop strategy, which the Bengals apparently do, maybe Driscoll's a guy that they think could be a good backup. Maybe they draft another that they could keep on the practice squad. And I don't know. I kind of feel like, if the price is right, the Bengals should definitely.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I just don't think the price. I mean, I don't know. I would if I'm them, I move if they get a good offer.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Again, the Bengals shock us sometimes. There was a string of years in the late 2000s and early 2010s where they had a handful of years in a row where they made a lot of trades, be it for Kelly Jennings and Taylor Mays and Brian Leonard and all of these guys. And other times they kind of sit on their hands and don't really do much. So we'll see. We'll see if the Bengals end up moving McCarron. It does hurt them a little bit that he's only got a year left on his rookie deal, but he's got a little bit more of an interesting resume than some of the other guys out there. What do you think, Bengals fans? You can get in touch with us in a number of different ways. You can contact the show via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can download the show on iTunes. You can download our content also by subscribing to our YouTube and SoundCloud channels. And as always, our content is on Cincy Jungle, part of the SB Nation Network. Myself, Connor, and Scott, the hosts of this show, all also provide written content for Cincy Jungle. So please check that out. Comment on the show, rate the show. We appreciate the feedback. We appreciate the live viewers that we have every week, and we want to encourage interaction there as well. Connor, where can they follow you on Twitter?
You follow me at How NFL. It's HOWE NFL.
Yep, and Connor provides a lot of good stuff, and one of which you should check out is that interesting clip of David DeCastro and Vontaze Burfict this week. It is a bit damning, but it's also a little, you don't see exactly what happened. So it's an interesting one. So if you're not following Connor yet, go check it out and check out that video clip in particular. It's pretty unique. And it kind of lets Steelers fans.
My whole thing was like by precedent, like the Burfict clip was a little shady. You couldn't see his leg. You kind of knew it was going to happen, but you didn't see it. I mean, DeCastro was kind of the same thing, and so if you're gonna fine him $75,000 for that, and you don't have the definitive evidence, do the same thing with DeCastro, or at least give him a $20,000 or $30,000 fine. Just do that. I mean, right. Be consistent somewhat.
Yeah, and those two have been going at it since all of last year, and into
both of them are.
Yeah. They like to get after it, to put it lightly. We're gonna do a couple more segments before we bid you adieu before the Christmas holiday, and one of them is obviously, speaking of Christmas, the Bengals playing the Texans on Christmas Eve. This one's in prime time, and this one's going to be really interesting to me because number one, the Texans are still in playoff contention here, and they've decided to move on from Brock Osweiler and go to Tom Savage very late in the season, and they're trying to ride a hot hand. Now, I wrote this in a post that'll probably be going up tomorrow, Friday, on Cincy Jungle. When you look at it, Savage had a great day against the Jaguars defense, and you sit here and you go, oh, Jaguars, they haven't, they've been pretty terrible this year. Well, the Jaguars actually have the number 4 passing defense in the NFL.
Yeah, that's insane.
So
I saw that too.
Yeah, so you can't sit here and go, okay, well, Savage was just beating up on garbage players. He actually was doing some good things against a pretty good Jaguars defense. Now, he didn't throw a touchdown, he didn't run for a touchdown, but he kind of managed the game, didn't turn the ball over, and let the rest of his team do its thing to get a 1-point win. Now you look at it, Savage is in charge of leading the Texans to a potential playoff berth. The Bengals don't really have much else to play for except for pride and finding out what they have in their team for the future. I'm not quite – you have A.J. Green coming back this week, which is another storyline. At least he says he's coming back from that hamstring injury after missing a very critical month on the Bengals schedule.
Yeah.
I don't know what to expect out of this one, Connor. I mean, is it kind of just expect the unexpected? Are the Bengals going to play loose and because they don't really have much to stress about anymore? Or I don't know what to expect out of this game.
It's Bengals Texans, which is the scariest game on the schedule for me every single year because it's the whole TJ Yates thing. Like Yates has beaten the Bengals.
Yeah, this one and the Bills now. For me. This one, the Texans and the Bills for me. Those are the two. Every time I see those two games on the schedule, I'm like, oh gosh, come on.
Yeah, Yates of hell. So I don't know. I mean, that's always scary for me. But even it's now scarier because the Texans have been. I don't know. They lose J.J. Watt, and they're the exact same team without him as they were with him. They have a really good defense who can just take over a game and make that play despite having a quarterback that puts them on the field for like seemingly the entire game every single week. DeAndre Hopkins has been having a bad year, and then they put in Savage. I'm pretty sure he had a decent game last week. I don't know. I think, and I mean, even it's eerily similar to last year because last year I'm pretty sure Arian Foster was their starter, and Foster was out for that game, and they had Alfred Bluen as their starter. Lamar Miller, as of today, being Thursday, hasn't practiced this week. He might miss it. I think if Miller misses it, it's really the ball's in Bengals court, and they have to win this game. Just because the Bengals always lose to the Texans. The only time they've beaten the Texans since Andy Dalton entered the NFL was when Ryan Mallett was their starter in like
2014.
I think 2014, and he was like, that was a weird game, which I didn't even watch. That was like one of the only games I haven't
He got knocked
watched,
out of that game, I think.
Really?
I think Mallett did, yeah.
Yeah, that was. I don't know. It's one of those games where you look at the teams on paper, and it's a team. The Bengals are still one of those teams you look at paper and you think, how does this team have 5 wins this year? Yeah. Like, the ball really just hasn't bounced their way this year, and that's just the way things have been. And the Texans are the complete inverse of the Bengals. They're not a good team. They have a bad quarterback. Their running back is, I'd put Lamar Miller probably the same level as Jeremy Hill when Jeremy Hill has a line. DeAndre Hopkins is at the very best the same level as AJ, but I'd say a little bit below. I'd say Brandon LaFell is probably better than any receiver behind DeAndre Hopkins on the Texans, even though they have Miller and Bryson Miller and Will Fuller, who are like, they're pretty good at what they do. They're still kind of niche players, and LaFell is a little more balanced, I think, than those guys. And then the offensive line, even on paper, the Texans I don't think they have a great line. I mean, I don't know. And then on defense, the Bengals have playmakers, and the Texans do too. And so I guess it's an interesting game in that sense, but it's just two teams, I think, that are pretty much the inverse of each other, in that the Texans have just barely squeaked out a win every single week in games where a lot of them they probably shouldn't have won. And then you have the Bengals, who they played one of the toughest schedules in the NFL this year, and the ball hasn't bounced their way, that whether it be missed kicks or, just points left on the field in the red zone, or defense when you drop. It's crazy. The Bengals are, I think, the top 3 team in terms of interceptions this year, when they've dropped, I think, like 20 picks. So it's weird in that sense. And the Texans games to me are always just weird. Like you said, it's really hard to make out this week, but just in general for me, because TJ Yates has a better winning percentage against the Bengals than Andy Dalton has against the Texans, and he's not even on the roster. But it's just like the Texans are just one of those teams that seems to have the Bengals number. And so for me, I just think it'd be huge, because so many players on the Bengals were around in 2011, 2012, and those playoff losses, I mean, even though you have a rookie sophomore quarterback in Dalton and just a young team, it's still just, it has to suck to lose in the playoffs 2 years in a row to the same team in pretty much the same type of game. I mean, so I don't know. And the game last year, the Bengals just really played terrible. Eifert dropped like 3 or 4 passes. Green dropped that pass, or Dalton overthrew Green, or either Dalton overthrew him or Green dropped it late in the game that could have won the game. And the corners held DeAndre Hopkins to pretty much just like one play, which was that touchdown grab, which was great coverage by Adam Jones, and just a perfect catch by Hopkins. It was just one of those snooze fests, and the Texans barely won. And that's what's scary about this week for me, is that the Texans just win those games this year, and the Bengals have lost those games. But I don't know. Maybe this is just the week, and I would just love to see the team put up some fight. I know fans want the high draft pick, and they want the Bengals to lose, whatever. Every Bengal fan on earth would be lying if they said they wanted the team to lose at halftime last game. And to see them beat a team that has just had their number, it would just feel great for me. I mean, and that's just for me, I guess, but it'd be fun.
There's a couple of things you brought up, Connor, that really kind of resonated with me there. I meant to, when we talked about the Steelers game, I meant to talk about the bounces not going the Bengals' way, and I'm not going to go way back, but I mean, you look at Alex Erickson getting tripped up by a shoelace, and that led to 3 points instead of a touchdown on the kick return. You mentioned the dropped interceptions that not only happened last week, but really throughout the entire season. Those are things that just have not gone the Bengals' way. And sometimes you have to be lucky, and sometimes you have to create your own luck. And in doing that, sometimes that comes down to coaching. And you mentioned that if you went man for man on the Texans roster and the Bengals roster, I would venture to guess that most people would say the Bengals have a more talented roster. And even with some of the injuries and things like that, but Bill O'Brien, for all of his salty language and whatever else that comes with him, he's put together improbable playoff seasons with the Texans with borderline not very good quarterbacks, and somehow they get it done. Now, in this game, you talked about the defense and J.J. Watt being out on IR, and what's amazing to me, I believe I looked this up, the Texans have the number one overall defense, I believe, and the number two passing defense in the NFL. And that is with J.J. Watt being on IR, and that is also with Jonathan Joseph, one of their best defensive players and former Bengal over the past handful of years, having 0 interceptions this year. So they are getting it done, and they are getting it done in a variety of different ways. One way they aren't getting it done, though, Connor, and it's kind of showing in the Watt absence, is they are like dead last in the league in sacking the quarterback. And when they're not getting those 12, 15, 20 sack seasons from J.J. Watt that they always get, there aren't so many players that are getting consistent pressure on the quarterback. And that, to me, plays positively into the Bengals' corner because the Bengals' offensive line has been so poor against the pass rush this year. So one thing that does scare me, though, the Texans employ a 3-4 defense. The Bengals traditionally struggle against 3-4 defenses, whether it's giving up pressure or Dalton not really reading what they're doing in the back seven very well. So it's going to be an interesting matchup. I don't think it's going to be a blowout by any means because the Bengals haven't really been blown out this year, nor have they really blown out anybody with the exception of, I guess, the Browns. I don't know. I think this is going to be interesting. I'm also interested to see guys like, especially with some of these guys being injured. Nick Vigil might get a larger role this year or this week. Josh Shaw, who has been getting more reps of late, will probably be getting more reps. You'll probably see Darqueze Dennard, I think, a little bit, even though the Bengals didn't really use him at all on defense last week. There's going to be a lot of young guys out there. Not really. Marvin Lewis will still play as veterans, and the starters will start, and all of those guys. But there's gonna be some youngsters in there. And one thing again for me that kind of, and I want to ask if this worries you a little bit, or if you're more interested in a positive way, Connor. There's a possibility that Jake Fisher is your starting right tackle this week, Cedric Ogbuehi is your starting left tackle, and Andrew Whitworth is your starting left guard as Clint Bowling is nursing a shoulder injury. Does that worry you, or are you more excited because that could be something that we see in 2017?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really rough to see anyone get hurt, especially Bowling, because you know that Bowling is the one guy who is going to start on the line next year. He's the one guy who's penciled into his starting role. I mean, I guess Bodine is too, just because he has improved this year, but fans don't want to come to that. They don't want to really admit that, I guess. But just, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Bowling is really the one guy who's under contract next year, who's like a guaranteed start on the line. And so it's weird you're taking that guy out of the lineup. And so now you have, like you said, it's probably going to be Ogbuehi, Whitworth, Bodine, Zeitler, Fisher, which is, it's weird and it's scary because Ogbuehi was really bad on the right side. But I still just kind of love it. And in a small sense, because you just have what the Bengals had been hoping for a while. And it's not ideal. Both guys who are probably going to play tackle this week have struggled wherever they've been playing and pretty much any snaps they've been playing. But not that they haven't been, the worst in the NFL. I think there's probably been worse tackles than both of them. Maybe not Ogbuehi, I'm not sure. But it's scary. But on the bright side, Ogbuehi can't get worse than he was on the right side. And that's kind of where the Bengals seem to have been hoping he'd play. And you get to see what Whitworth could be like on the inside, especially if Zeitler just gets some massive offer and free agency and the Bengals just ultimately don't want to pay him, which I hope doesn't happen, but you just never know with things like that. It would be interesting to see if Whitworth is still able to kick inside and play guard like he did in 2013. And then just to see what, if Zeitler just brings his A game and really finishes off the year strong. I mean, he had a really good game last year, and so maybe he just keeps on really playing at that dominant level he's been playing and earns himself a new contract, hopefully in Cincinnati. But I think, kind of like you said, it's fun and it's interesting. In the same sense, I think the Texans' pass rush is a little bit undersold. I mean, granted, they haven't put the sacks together, and that counts for something. But they still have three pretty good guys in Jadeveon Clowney, Whitney Merciless, and Bernardrick McKinney. I think McKinney plays inside linebacker. I could be wrong, but Clowney's been having a really good year. I think he just made the Pro Bowl, and granted, the Pro Bowl is a popularity contest, but he's been playing really well. Merciless is one of the most perennially underrated pass rushers. He's not
Yeah,
like
he's a good player.
an elite
He's a good
player by
player.
any means, but he's definitely good. And so it's scary in that sense that you still have guys who are capable of taking over a game. Granted, they haven't been the consistent guys like Dunlap or the other guys who are generally in the Pro Bowl every year. Ryan Kerrigan or Cam Jordan, Michael Bennett, whatever it might be. But it'll be interesting, I think, to say the least. And it's a game that really doesn't have that many implications. And so you figure this is like your really one opportunity to do it. And so it's exciting that you get to see that, I guess. And you hope it works out for the best. I mean, it just makes things complicated. I mean, where ultimately, if Obuehi plays well, and that's the thing, is the Bengals are probably going to hope Obuehi starts for them no matter what next year, along with Jake Fisher. And so then you have to, I think we've had this discussion before, but then you have to decide, all right, between Zeitler and Whitworth, unless one of them is willing to play backup, which Zeitler will not, and Whitworth is still like a really good. People are underselling how good he is. Granted, I've been pretty big on saying that he's not the same player he once was. I don't think he is, but he's still one of the best, if not an elite player at his position. And so it's weird. The Bengals are in a conundrum in the sense that their best players are the guys that are leaving the team or could leave the team, whereas their guys who they hope can improve are the guys that are starting for them, which is definitely weird. And it's strange that Bengal fans are always very hopeful that the team will play some of the young guys, and then the offensive line, they have been playing the young guys and it hasn't been pretty. And so maybe you kind of understand a little bit more why they're so hesitant to do so. Or maybe it's just, maybe it's just an anomaly, and the younger players will have a better impact at other player positions across the board. Yeah, I mean, it'll make the game more exciting, I guess.
It's going to be an interesting year in 2017 to see what the Bengals starting offensive line looks like. If the Bengals shell out the money to Kevin Zeitler, or if they decide to keep Andrew Whitworth around and maybe kick him into guard. Is Cedric Obuehi a guard? Where does Christian Westerman fit in, the guy they supposedly like? So it's going to be very interesting to see how the Bengals offensive line looks next year. That being said, you might get a little bit of a glimpse of that this week against the Texans. And, you mentioned the Texans, some of the guys not named J.J. Watt playing well. That's what you get that's the kind of defensive unit you get when you draft a bunch of good players. I believe Merciless was a first-round pick, if I'm not mistaken. I know Jadeveon Clowney was, what was he, number 2 overall? You have Watt, who was a first-round pick. I mentioned
Clowney was number 1, I think.
Yeah. Oh, number
McKinney
1 overall.
McKinney was a first or second. I think McKinney was.
Yeah. And then they've got Joseph, who was a Bengals former first round pick. So they've got a lot of high round picks on defense, and that's why that defense is so tough. Connor, real quick before we get into our last segment here, do you have a score prediction for this game?
I'll take the Bengals. I always do, but I legitimately think they have a chance to win, and especially with Green back, I think that really, really makes things easy for them. Their biggest issue in the past has been offense, or at least in the past few weeks, and so I'll take them 21 to 13.
Okay, 21 to 13. To kind of pat myself on the back a little bit, I've been largely in the lead in our weekly pick'em pool that you put together, Connor.
You've been murdering it. It's scary.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because every week I look at it, I'm like, God, I wish I put some money on some of these things and picked the same way. I'd probably be doing pretty well. But if you look, I don't have my track record in front of me, but if you probably look on how I've picked the Bengals on this show, my record's got to be really poor. So I don't even know what to pick here. I'm going to say the Bengals lose, and just because I don't think this is not a venue they've played well at. That defense is going to be hard for the Bengals to make a lot of plays, especially with Jeremy Hill banged up. AJ Green just coming back potentially. Giovanni Bernard out of the lineup. I think it'll be close. I'll say 17-14 Bengals. Or excuse me, 17-14 Texans.
I guess in
Um,
that sense, it's good that this year's the year that the Bengals are having a down year and it's at NRG Stadium because, if the Super Bowl happened and they managed to get there, that's the one venue they can't really play that
they
well
can't
at.
win. Yeah, they can't win. So exactly. All right. Well, those are our thoughts on the Texans game and our score predictions. If you have a prediction, send them our way. We're on Twitter at Bengals OBI. You can get in touch with us via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. Again, you can subscribe to our YouTube and SoundCloud channels, download us on iTunes, and check out this show as well on cincyjungle.com. We appreciate the support. One final segment before we get out of here, Connor, and it revolves around the fact that we are – I guess it's just because I'm a little older than you, but this year flew by, and
No, it flew by for me too, I think.
yeah, I mean some of it positive. Maybe the negative is the fact that the Bengals didn't play so well this year, but we are on the cusp of 2017. We're going to be celebrating Christmas here, and we're going to be celebrating the new year in just over a week. So let's kind of say, Thanksgiving's kind of the time to be thankful and what have you, but so is Christmas. You have a lot of people have a lot to be thankful for, whether it's friends, family, the holidays, gifts, giving gifts, the whole thing. And it's also a time for a lot of people to turn the page and try and better themselves for the new year. So we're going to kind of do this with a Bengals spin. We're going to talk about First, I'm going to ask you, Connor, what was the best moment of 2016? You kind of, when we were going on the air, you kind of tried to cheat a little bit, and you mentioned Vontaze Burfict's interception against Ben Roethlisberger in the wild card game when he ran into the tunnel, which technically was 2016 on the calendar, but not really the 2016 Bengals season. And if that game was any indication as to how 2016 would go for the Bengals, we should have probably read the writing on the wall. But there was still a lot to like this year. What are one or maybe just a couple of short ones of some of the best memories you have so far of the Bengals season with 2 games remaining?
Yeah, there's definitely a few. I think if you're going like in the 2016 season, like where the pinnacle of my excitedness was, I'd probably say on that Marcus Hunt blocked field goal in the Jets game, because I think that is like the highest I was riding on this team. That's the last time I was
You just wanted to be right about
go.
that. You just wanted to be right.
Yeah, no, I definitely just wanted to be right, but that was also like that was like the last time. I mean, week 2, 3, I think 4, they lost, and so that was really like the highest I was on this team, and the entire year was like right when he blocked that field goal, and you're just like, I think it was extra point, and you were just, oh, the Bengals are gonna beat the Jets on like 9/11 in New York. What a huge deal, and this is gonna be a huge year for the Bengals, and that's kind of where, I mean, that's like my pinnacle of the season. But I would say like the best memory, it's hard. There really weren't like any huge. I mean, there weren't like last year. If you're going regular season, the easiest one would have easily been that AJ Green touchdown against the Ravens when he, just made something out of nothing and broke those 2 tackles for the game when he touchdown or whatever. But this year didn't really have, I guess, at least from where I'm remembering, those many plays, at least in games that weren't against the Browns. I know that they had a huge game against the Dolphins as well, but I think for me, probably my favorite memory was that again in the first game against the Steelers, I was really like, I don't know, I've always been kind of hoping that I always kind of root for the guys that all the other people seem to root against. I've always just wanted to give those guys a chance, and Drake Kirkpatrick is really one of them. And that Steelers game, when they played them for the first time, I believe he got targeted 3 times, and he had 2 pass deflections and an interception. And that was really the point where I'd been really saying, I think Dre's in for a big year. I hope he's, and granted, I've been wrong on a lot of things. I thought George Iloka was going to become a top 10 safety this year. That didn't pan out. I thought Jeremy Hill was going to have a good year. That didn't really pan out. So a lot of things didn't really pan out a ton, but that one Dre moment, it wasn't really as much about me being right, but it was just seeing the young guy, the former first round pick who everyone was calling a bust, have that huge game. And that was really like, just the pinnacle of a season, but it was also just the highlight of a year that's been really, really underrated by a guy who's transformed into the best player in the Bengals secondary, which is kind of amazing to think about considering last year he was probably the worst player in the Bengals secondary, at least if you're thinking starters. So it was. I mean, that was a huge day for him, and it was fun to watch.
Yeah, Drake Kirkpatrick has, he's not an all world corner. He's probably never going to be a Pro Bowl corner. Maybe a little more time will get him as such, or if the Bengals end up, kind of sporting that swarming defense that we've seen from Seattle and even their own units in the past. But he does have 3 interceptions this year, which ties a career high with 2 other seasons, and
Yeah.
8 pass deflections.
Some of them huge, like the one against the Jets too on Brandon Marshall. That play was like I
Yep.
still remember that one vividly too.
Yep. Last year he had far more tackles, 70 tackles, but he didn't have any and double the pass deflections, 16, but he didn't have any interceptions, which kind of caused a lot of fans to sour on him this year. But the Bengals
And
gave
he
him
got
another
targeted
chance.
so much last year too.
Yep.
He got targeted. I think Marcus Peters was the only corner in the league who got targeted to him more than him last year.
Yep. So he's stepped up a bit this year. It's going to be interesting to see what the Bengals do with him because he's going to be an impending free agent next season. So will the Bengals pony up the dough there? Will Dre want to stay? He seems to like Cincinnati from sights and sounds that we've seen from him. But it's going to depend on his contract status there. But that's another conversation for another time. Best of 2016. I guess I've got 2 things. One of which might sound actually both might sound a little weird because they were both Bengals losses. But I went to many of you know I went to the game in week 3, the home opener against Denver, and it was my first time out there in probably 10 or 11 years, and it was very, very cool going just doing. I write a bunch of stuff on Cincy Jungle. I do this podcast. I've done other podcasts. I've covered the team. I've kind of been a longtime fan, but I've also covered the team and tried to be a little bit non-biased as possible. And I kind of got to wear my full-blown fan cap that weekend. And even though the Bengals lost, we had great seats. The weather was incredible. The Bengals started off hot in that game, and it was a really cool experience. Met a lot of cool people around the town. Kind of went to a bunch of different shops, and from being from Southern California, for me, it was just a very cool experience, and one I hope to repeat in the near future as well. So that was just one as a personal thing. I also really liked, believe it or not, I really, really enjoyed for the first time in a while this year the first half of last week's game against the Steelers. The Bengals were. Go ahead.
Gonna say that one too.
Yeah, the Bengals.
I was just gonna say that was huge.
Yeah, the Bengals were absolutely taking it to the Steelers, and they were doing it in a way that was very Pittsburgh-esque. And they were getting the first downs they needed and frustrating the Steelers defense. They were running the ball pretty well. I mean, they weren't absolutely gouging them for 20, 30, 40-yard runs, but Rex Burkhead and Jeremy Hill were making plays. They were holding them to field goals on defense. They got a huge special teams return. When you have a big special teams return, you're holding the opposing offense to field goals, and you're scoring touchdowns and or field goals, and you have an 11-point lead at halftime. That's a game you should win. That's kind of the bottom line there. But it didn't end up that way. However, watching that first half and seeing the inspired play, you can say what you want now that the Bengals lost about Jeremy Hill and his antics with the terrible towel. I personally loved it because I have zero respect for Steelers fan base. That's just me.
Yeah, no, I loved it.
So I really, that was a memory, and it was on a week, as we mentioned earlier when we reviewed the game. It was on a week when the Bengals really needed to win, and regardless if they got the help or not, they came out in that first half and they really took it to the Steelers in a way that was very Steelers-like. And it's unfortunate they couldn't do it for 4 quarters. It's unfortunate that it was a similar type of result to what happened to the same team in the wild card game, but I did like those first 2 quarters. Now, Connor, looking ahead to the future, if you're the Bengals, if you're Mike Brown, if you're Marvin Lewis and you actually stay with the club this year, What is your 2017 New Year's resolution for the Bengals as they try and recover from this um, what could be a anywhere from a 5 to 7 win season?
Yeah, and just to add on to what you said in the last like the Steeler game, that Erickson return was the loudest I've cheered for this team in the entire year since at least the Jets game or the entire year. That one play when he broke off, he just never really got that play that he was able to break. And he's one of the top 10 I think kick returners in the NFL this year in terms of yardage per kick return. But that one when he just it was like 70 something yards, and it looked like he tripped himself to prevent the
I mean, the
touchdown.
guy
I mean,
got
that
a
was
freaking
just
shoelace or something. I mean, it was unbelievable. But
it was
he is a
that
guy.
was a
To your
cage play.
point, he is a guy that his step. He started off the year very poorly, and he was a guy that a lot of
And
people
he
were like,
improved a
"What?
lot.
Yep, yep." That's what I was going to say. He has been a steadily improving player over the last handful of weeks. But go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of New Year's resolutions, um, I mean, I would love to just put on my Madden hat and say, sign Alshon Jeffrey, sign every big name free agent possible, and trade for trade your seventh round pick for Earl Thomas, and just pick up Tom Brady off waivers. But that's just not the way it works.
No,
And so if we're going like realistic scenarios here, and I'm the Bengals, it's really not that big of a, it's not a hot free agent class. It's really not. There's some there's a lot of niche like receivers who have speed. I know you have I couldn't name you the guys, but there's a lot of receivers who have kind of just been flameouts from other teams, and Michael Floyd was one of those guys before he got picked up off waivers by the Patriots, which I'm glad the Bengals didn't go for him because it didn't
Side
seem like
note,
that would have
side
worked.
note, Patriots get lauded for a move like that. Bengals would have been absolutely dragged through the mud
They
if
would
they
have
might
gotten
have got it.
reamed for
Yes,
that. Yeah.
yes,
Oh my
yes.
gosh.
That's the NFL
Um,
these days. Yeah.
yeah, and people are saying Rex Burkhead's going to go to the Patriots. And, I don't know about that. Just because he's white, it doesn't mean the Patriots need Rex Burkhead when they already have Deion Lewis. Doesn't make sense to me. But anyways, that aside, I was just kind of out of nowhere. If I'm the Bengals and you're picking in the top 10 probably. I'm going either defensive end or linebacker. Those are the two positions. There's going to be a guy at one of those two positions that you
Yeah.
pick there. That's what I'm saying. If I'm the Bengals, you pick a guy who's a defensive end or a linebacker. I'm hoping it'd be, a Jonathan Allen, a Miles Garrett at defensive end. Maybe even the guy from Tennessee. I think his name's Derek Barnett.
Yep.
But inside linebacker would be nice too. Zach Cunningham or Reuben Foster. One of those five guys I would love. And I mean, receiver wouldn't be the end of the world. I love Corey Davis or Mike Williams or maybe even John Ross. But one of those five, either linebackers or D ends, those are the two huge glaring positions of need the Bengals haven't really had in a long time. The Bengals, every single draft, seem to not really have any positions where you absolutely have to take a player at this position. But here in 2016, I think, or in the 2017 draft, you have to take a linebacker or defensive end high. Even if Nick Vigil ends up panning out, it just the way Paul Gunther's defense works, it would never hurt to have another speedy linebacker who can make plays.
I agree with you, and mine's more of a macro. You got a little more specific than I am going to with my Bengals 2017 New Year's resolution, but it does involve the draft. Part of what I'm talking about does involve the draft. The Bengals need to do two things. They need to be far more aggressive and not be scared to be aggressive or make changes. And they need to do it'll what that will do is instill a reinvigoration of the fan base, if you will. I mentioned I was at that Broncos Bengals game in week 3, and you felt it in the stadium when the Bengals fell behind. You heard the sighs and the exasperation, and these fans are tired of the same type of thing, myself included. Whether it's losing games against these teams you shouldn't lose against, or never really getting past the big boys, never really getting past the postseason hump. You need to start doing things to create a team that will do that. Now, obviously, maybe it takes a top 10 pick and getting a dominant pass rusher that will help you do that. There is never a problem with getting a dominant pass rusher. And now you have Andrew Billings, who is a supposed to be a pretty solid defensive tackle who will be coming back next year. So if you add in a good pass rusher to, Carlos Dunlap, who's still producing, Michael Johnson, who kind of is not, but you have a young pass rusher with those guys. You have Andrew Billings, you have Geno Atkins. All of a sudden,
Maybe
one
Mark
player there.
Hardison too.
Yeah. So things like that, but they need to do more in the draft, and they need to do more in free agency. They need to move. They can't be stagnant. And I think that I wrote a post about this a couple weeks ago, and I'm more of a free agency guy than many others, and I'm not the guy who says you got to spend, you got to go get the Ndamukong Suhs of the free agency class every year, because that undoubtedly, though it's working out for the Dolphins now, I mean, we've seen other teams that do that and it doesn't work. You need to draft well. You need to move and shake in the draft. You need to move up and back in the draft. You need to make sure you hit on those players, but you also need to do enough in free agency to round out your roster. And the Bengals have continuously not moved up in the draft and have been leapfrogged by a number of other teams for players they probably wanted because they sat there. And they haven't done anything in free agency except pick up the scraps and get guys on cheap deals. And you can get by on that for a while, but you can't consistently build a championship team in doing so. There's examples of both that people can throw out, many of which are outliers, but this team needs to do something different and be different than it's been over the past, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, however long it's been, to be a different type of team, to be, a more aggressive, a more threatening type of team to the rest of the NFL. And I think you're on the right track, Connor. I am in the boat of, I do want a wide receiver high for the Bengals, especially a speedy one in next year's draft. But I think if you have Geno Atkins, Carlos Dunlap, Vontaze Burfict, and a number of other guys there, I think if you just stack the defense and you continue to hope that Andy Dalton and AJ Green stay healthy, I think good things will come. I also think the offensive line probably needs some depth, maybe even a starter or two. But I think they need to be flexible, and they need to be more aggressive than they have been in years past. And that's my New Year's resolution. I hope, because I know he's watching live, I hope Mike Brown takes my word for it. Those are our New Year's resolutions.
I was just going to say that on that same note, you look at a team, and it doesn't, the free agent spending, I totally agree with you there. It's just a matter of, you have to find the guys that are just not getting paid as much as the other guys who are making plays. You look at the Chargers, and rewind the tape, because I was saying this in the offseason, if people don't want to believe me, but and it's easy to say hindsight's 2020, but they picked up Travis Benjamin, Casey Hayward, and Brandon Mebane. And Benjamin hasn't really been the greatest for them. He fumbled a few plays that were huge on a kick return. He got beat out by Tyrell Williams as the team's number one receiver when Keenan Allen got hurt. That being said, he'd be a huge number 3 for them if Keenan Allen and Tyrell Williams come back healthy. He's what the Bengals really could have used. But you look at Casey Hayward, and the dude leads the league in interceptions. He completely shut down Amari Cooper last week like it was nothing. And I don't want to be like, pat myself on the back, but I saw it coming. The guy's at 26. I think he was 26 when he hit the free agent market. He had a huge year in Green Bay. It was the best slot corner in the NFL, and the Chargers got him for one of the most reasonable deals in all of free agency. Then they added Brandon Mebane, who I have no idea why he didn't re-sign in Seattle. I know he signed in San Diego because it was close to his hometown of LA, but he was a huge playmaker before he got put on IR. Made a ton of plays in the run game, and that was a really big part, along with Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram developing, that helped the Chargers turn into one of the best run defenses in the NFL this year. And so if you're the Bengals, you look at free agency, and there's some guys. I mean, especially with playing between Geno Atkins and Carlos Dunlap, if they don't think Billings is ready yet, you have a guy like Dontari Poe at defensive tackle who, maybe he gets iced out in Kansas City because they have a lot of defensive tackle talent, or even a Nick Fairley who fans have wanted to see in orange and black for so long. And there's just guys down the list. There's not really a lot of top tier free agent talent, not even probably as good as last year, like I earlier mentioned, especially at receiver, where a lot of fans want to see um, free agents, just because I think fans really like those flashy signings. But for all of that being said, I think the Bengals are still. It's weird that a 5-win team is set at so many positions. Obviously, they have to re-sign at least one of Whitworth and or Zeitler, and then hopefully that line, the starters at least are set, and then you have a guy like Westerman who could potentially be the first guy off the bench. But you have Green, and you hope LaFell signs on a team-friendly deal. If you're the Bengals, probably you have Tyler Boyd and Cody Core, and that kind of seems like your receiver core with. Then you have tight end where you're set. You have running back who hopefully you get Burkhead or maybe you get another guy there because you're probably gonna have the roster space if Burkhead gets a nice contract from someone to play as the starter, the number two. And then on defense, like I was just saying, if you're the Bengals, you hope that Billings is that guy who fills in for Domata Peko. And then from there, you really only have positions of depth, or maybe if Vigil isn't the guy, a guy next to Vontez Perfect in nickel packages at linebacker. But from there, even if Dre leaves, which you hope he doesn't, you have a ton of first round corners ready to take those snaps. And then you have safeties who, Iloka and Sean Williams, you're hoping are going to be even better this next year than they were this year. And this year they weren't terrible, they weren't great, they were kind of in the middle. But those guys both have high ceilings, and so I mean, from there, you hope the Bengals maybe sign a kicker in free agency. That would be like the one thing I would really, really want them to sign, and maybe even a punter if I don't know if Huber's under contract. I think he's under contract for next year, but there's still not a lot of needs, which is surprising for this team, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I totally agree with you. I think being aggressive is definitely something they need to do more of, and I think that starts with maybe just getting more aggressive in the draft and trading up if they see a defensive end there they like, or making that ballsy move and taking a linebacker in the top 10, even if he on draft boards isn't in the top 10. I mean, it'd be interesting.
Yep, you got to get the guys you want. I mean, that's the bottom line. And the Bengals, either in free agency they'll have a visit and maybe they deem the player wanting too much money than they're willing to spend, or they've got overconfident in the draft and they said, let's sit back and see who falls to us regardless of position. And there's undoubtedly every team, no matter what, has a handful of guys they really, really like in every draft class. And sometimes to get that player, you have to sacrifice picks, you have to move around, you have to do things. The Bengals just what they've done has worked to an extent, but it's not working to its maximum potential. So in that respect, if you're looking at the football team as a business, you have to make different decisions and you have to have a different approach in order to get your business to the level that everybody wants it to be at, which is a championship level. So that's my resolution. You had a good one as well. I think both of ours kind of tie into each other, Connor. If any of our listeners, if you guys have New Year's resolutions for the Bengals, we would love to hear them, and we'd love to do it on our next, put them on the air for the next show as we head to the new year. And, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know. Again, email the obinsider@gmail.com, on Twitter @BengalsOBI. You can leave a comment or whatever on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes. We also read the comments on the Cincy Jungle post, so check those out. But we want to hear from you and let us know what your 2017 Bengals resolutions are. We're going to close up shop. I want to say again, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever holiday you might be celebrating this time of year. Please be safe. Please have fun with friends and family. And thanks again for making this a fun. Even though the Bengals haven't given us as fun of a year as we have hoped to do, I know I can speak for Scott Schultze, who is not with us tonight. I know I can speak for him and probably Connor here to say that this has been a fun experiment for us to do this new show, and we've had a lot of support both from SB Nation and Cincy Jungle as well as all of the listeners, and we greatly appreciate that. There's a lot of work that goes into this, both from all of the co-hosts to people at Cincy Jungle and all of that. So we're grateful for that. And we're grateful for you to spending time to view us live, download our show. We're very flattered and we're very grateful that you support us. So thank you very much. Have a great holiday season. Connor, anything else before I get out of here?
No, just happy holidays, whatever you celebrate, and thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. And thanks for being here, Connor. I know this time of year can be a little hectic with scheduling and all of that. So I appreciate you making time. And let's hope for a more prosperous 2017 for everybody, but also for the Bengals. Who Day, folks, and we'll talk to you soon.